Patrice Lockert Anthony is the immediate past president of Green Star Cooperative Market Incorporated. She was the first African-American or any person of color to head the organization in its 45-year plus history. She continues to address that challenge through her company, Black Label Consulting and Coaching, whose vision and mission is working toward racial equity and developing curricula that move that vision forward. Patrice is ever committed to being part of the resistance that helps shape our communities, our nation, and our world into what they can be. She's taught workshops on cultural appropriation before, and we are so grateful for your willingness, Patrice, to talk with us in the Regenerate community about cultural appropriation and regenerative land stewardship. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Patrice, while I pull up your slideshow.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is going to be an interesting partnership. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, maybe a little less. And then we're going to have a 25-minute discussion, and then 15 minutes, I believe, after that, in order to narrow down some of the top suggestions that you come up with in the 25-minute session. And then I'm just going to take 5 minutes to close us out with the prayer and the hope and the divine wish that you're going to take what we've talked about and really mull it over, take it in, and share it. And most importantly, take action. My clock just started. Cultural appropriation, agriculture's racial and political realities, the truth or consequences of saving our land, lives, and planet. And I want to draw your attention to the intention written about this conference: centering marginalized people who have long practiced regenerative agriculture and land stewardship. That's so very important, not just the action of creating that intention, but to dive into that knowledge, that existing knowledge that too many, and in particular, and I'm only going to be speaking primarily about the United States of America. I know what's happening around the world, but I want to focus us in on what's happening here and what has happened here. And so when we talk about regenerative practices, when we talk about land stewardship, when we center that, when we focus on it and draw pictures, when there's advertising, marketing on it, and when all of that is only ever done with white faces, white voices, we have a problem. For instance, in the documentary Kiss the Ground on Netflix, you have an entire movie, an entire documentary that fails to honor all that came before white Americans decided to do and think about what came before from other people. So you have Indigenous Americans who were the most prolific and profound land stewards that our planet may have ever known outside of Africa, where the horrible effects of climate change and other things, the destruction of land didn't happen until colonialism. Prior to that, land stewardship was again prolific and profound. In fact, there has just been found both in West Africa and Amazonia. In Amazonia, I don't know if they've placed the timing of it, but in West Africa, they have found sites that go back at least 700 years where there was active regenerative agriculture happening, land stewardship, people taking care of the land and the planet. So this is not a new thing by any means. And for those who, I don't know how old we all are, but surely most of us have heard of that old tale, child's tale, the goose that laid the golden egg. And of course, we know that the moral of that tale is the moral of the story behind why we need regenerative agriculture, why we need to go back to regenerative agriculture, the practices that Africans brought here as part of the slave trade, that indigenous populations had already been practicing here, that white Americans, white immigrants here stamped out, tried to destroy, and usually in the name of greed. But now that the planet is having such problems, we're beginning to discuss regenerative practices as though they are just being created. And that's a problem. Now, the people who produced Kiss the Ground from an organization called Kiss the Ground actually did come out and apologize. And they've done numerous things to make up for the rather grave faux pas. But there aren't enough organizations doing that. There just aren't. Next slide, please. Naming the problem. Notions of white supremacy and a failure to do the work of discrediting and dismantling it by white Americans stops us all from solving ever-growing and fast-evolving food, land, and climate crises. And when I say by white Americans, I mean that because most of the work around healing the impact and the destruction of racism, of gender issues, of class issues have been done by people of color, or people of color have been marginalized, oppressed, they've been silenced, so that their voices, their experience, their lived experience hasn't been perceived by the white majority, which is a mistake that we will get to in a moment. Next slide, please. What you don't know can hurt you. What you dismiss can hurt you. What you ignore can hurt you. What you don't want to bother with. Racism, bigotry, privilege, and prejudice are impractical BS charlatanism, which absolutely negatively impacts solving the problems of climate change, soil erosion and loss, food production, and our planet's destruction. The reason for that, for me, is clear, and I want to help explain my thinking on that, because I know that for many white Americans, it gets very uncomfortable and very tense when we start talking about racism and bigotry and privilege and prejudice. yet they are there. They've been there from the beginning of this country in terms of European immigration here and the colonialization of this country. It was designed to be what it is. It was designed around white supremacy. It was designed to marginalize people who were not white. It was designed to marginalize women. If we don't wrap our brains and our arms around that, if we don't wrap our spirits around it and get a handle on that, we cannot address it. And this absolutely impacts how we address our fast evolving crisis of climate change, soil erosion, food production, and the word justice, which applies all the way across the board with breadth and depth. It's important that the peoples who are used to not having to listen and know and acknowledge and take action on, get used to it. Because it is only in learning about this and acknowledging this and taking the time and doing the work of acting against it, an active resistance against racism, bigotry, privilege, and prejudice, because they are impractical. They are wrong. They are in many ways evil, but they are also at a basic level simply impractical for addressing the issues that we need to if we're going to shift the dynamic of this destruction. Next slide, please. This is a quote by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. It is not just Negroes, but all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry. To understand the real import of this quote, you would need to know a little about Lyndon Baines Johnson. LBJ was a good old boy from the South, and he was raised based on the Jim Crow laws and rules of racism and bigotry. He was raised to oppress, to silence. He was raised to be accepting of many of those practices that negated humanity of other. And yet, Lyndon Baines Johnson, outside of Lincoln, who I have some questions about, but outside of Lincoln, Lyndon Baines Johnson did the most for civil rights of any other president of his time before, and many of them that came after. But he dealt with cognitive dissonance, and that was a large part of his mental health issues later in his life. It's difficult to be raised on that and to live that reality, and then evolve into someone who recognized the wrongs. But he was also a practical man, and he combined his practicality with what was right, even while constantly and consistently being in that seat of a racist white Southern man. He used the N word like nobody's business all the time, even while working on these issues of civil rights. And therein lies the most important issue for white America when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to food and racial justice, when it comes to getting past privilege and bigotry. When you grow up with something that was with you from the time you were created in your mother's womb, because we all know now that you hear and sense and feel from the womb. So if you have parents or grandparents, church members, teachers, anyone in your community that had racist notions or supremacist notions of white citizens, white America, you were impacted by it. You can't avoid it. Truthfully, none of us can. But that's just how it is, right? You can't avoid it. It was designed that way. We live with it every single moment of every single day. And it does make for cognitive dissonance. So what do you do to resist that? You live in a conscientious state. You read, you write, you discuss, you act. And it may not be enough to get you over the line, but it will be enough most times to create an ally, to be an ally, to join with others, whatever their color, whatever their culture, whatever their faith, and get the work done that we need done if we're going to survive our own planet. Next slide. Practical realities versus systemic marginalizing. The practical reality is that our planet is dying. Our practical reality is that we think there isn't enough food for everybody because we've been taught to think that way. We've been thinking that there's not enough land or money, which is all false. Systemic marginalizing has allowed us to believe those untruths. You go back to practical realities, you accept that the systemic marginalizing is untrue because there's plenty of proof for you to believe that. And you decide, because it's a practical decision, that if we're going to solve for this, we're going to work together, which means you have to take your foot off of people's necks and allow them to actively, vocally, and constantly participate in what is necessary to resolve these issues. Next slide. African-American agricultural innovators. This is what this comes to with practical realities versus systemic marginalization and cultural appropriation. When the Atlantic slave trade was at its highest point, it was in its full force. African slaves, whatever their level of intelligence, geniuses, well, they weren't allowed to own property, and they certainly weren't allowed intellectual property rights. So everything they invented, everything they innovated became, think of it as ipso facto. The masters took credit for and reaped the benefits of monetary as well as repute of the innovations and inventions of those African-American slaves. And that is a practice which in different forms continues through today. Henry Blair, in 1834, he was the second African-American to be given a patent. If I remember correctly, Henry Blair bought his freedom and his siblings' freedom. I can't remember exactly. I have to look that up again. But he created two models of seed planters. For one, for corn, and it was a mechanism that plowed, seeded, and then covered over the seeds, all in one go. And then he also invented a cotton planter. It changed the way farming was done. George Washington Carver, I think most people have heard of him. He was an agricultural and industrial innovator. He created 300 plus products derived from peanuts. He also innovated agricultural methods, developed an ag extension program that taught farmers to restore nitrogen to soils that were depleted from cotton plantings. Alternative plants like peanuts, of course, that was his thing, and sweet potatoes. He also founded an industrial research lab to discover applications for those alternative crops, the same way he had done with peanuts. Norbert Rillieux had a patent for the multiple effect vacuum evaporator used for sugar processing, which changed that entire industry, but also used for condensed milk, gelatin, soap, glue, and whiskey. Frederick McKinley Jones, check this one out. A mechanical genius, he invented the refrigerated truck, which went on to include uses for railroad cars, ships, and planes. He also had 60 other patents. And yes, his work ultimately changed the way the world eats and drinks, as well as having medical and scientific uses. You can't go anywhere, certainly not in the Western world, and most of the Eastern world, undeveloped countries and underdeveloped countries. There are uses that his creations have given us. And it's just imperative that we note that and honor that, because we have trucks traveling the highways and byways that are refrigerated, that get our products to us for good and bad, because I really hate it when tomatoes get picked early, but things like that. And then you have Booker T. Watley, a horticulturalist and professor of agriculture at Tuskegee University. In the 60s and 70s, he suggested to and taught Black farmers suffering from civil rights abuses to implement CSAs, community, you guys know it, don't you? So those CSAs were for survival. And you guys have heard that before. Necessity is the mother of invention. They had a hard time selling their produce, their crops. And he is the one who brought in to their communities CSAs to, CSAs to work with not just the farmers who needed to sell their produce, but the other folks in the communities, people of color, mostly African American, who also needed cheaper ways to get their foods. He is also an advocate, or was an advocate, for regenerative agriculture, among other environmental practices. One of the reasons I put him here is because CSAs popularly are noted to have started in America from two New England farms. One is white-owned and one is member-owned. And that was in 1986. But this work was being done long before that. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm going to go back. No, you don't need to go back to the slide. I want to go back to Frederick McKinley Jones with refrigerated truck, because he had 60 other patents. And I believe this company is still going. He was one of the founders for Thermo King Corporation in Minneapolis back in 1935. So that's an important point. If you want to look that up, please do. These are a series of photographs that I just love. Fresh, whole foods. I also love vertical gardening, vertical growing in greenhouses, and then of course, some African and African American farmers. Next slide. Black soil. Gotta love it. Next slide. Eggs. New life. A new lens, a new perspective on change, for healing the land and the planet and her people. So let's try for a rebirth of reason. Let's try to be a real community, a whole community. Let's talk about what it means to work together. Let's talk about ways in which white America's citizens may participate in inclusive work that saves us all. Let's talk about how truly creative and innovative African Americans have been, how much work on behalf of our nation Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants have been. They are the ones who have largely toiled in our agricultural fields, being subject to pesticides and the diseases that come from them, being paid far less than their work is worth. Not to mention everything that happened in slavery, the farms that were stolen from Japanese Americans when they were forced into camps, the work and the stewardship of indigenous people of our lands. This is work that we must honor, we must acknowledge, and we must resist the silencing that happens in favor of this belief that things that are created and innovated and done, painted, sung, danced, comes from white America. It's such a dangerous thing, white supremacy, because it's so untrue, but it is so much a part of our culture going back 500 years. that it can be difficult to shake, and it's not the responsibility of people of color to do all the work of healing. White Americans must participate. I don't know if you guys, if you know the word imprimatur. It's, the definition is a person's acceptance or guarantee that something is of a good standard. And this is why I have a problem with it, because white supremacy is an imprimatur. And white supremacy is such an imprimatur that in America, that few American systems, policies, laws, or programs question the origins of their lens, perspective, or reason. And when I say reason, I mean critical reasoning, logic. It is an unwieldy untruth that whites own manifest destiny, that whites are the most intelligent, that whites have done it all. It defies logic. It is not true. And if we are going to fix this planet, if we are going to address justice, then we have to get real about what is and what ain't, and start doing the work that brings us all together to address these problems. And it is as much, if not more, the problem of white America as it is the rest of America, except most of the work has been done on the side of the rest of America. And that can't continue. When you see, and these were just the African Americans I showed who had done these amazing things. And that was just in agriculture. That was just in agriculture. So I want to say something that I say when I'm working with middle school and high school youth. And it is this. Imagine what could be done, what could be created if this genius has happened. Imagine what could be done if this country's resources were available to people who have been silenced and marginalized and who have had to scrape and scrap for everything they have done to survive and thrive. And even when we have thrived, there is a history, a documented history of even when we have thrived, white Americans come in and literally burn it down. Not just a farm here, a farm there, sometimes whole communities. Black Wall Street, if you want to look that up. And there are plenty of other examples, not just Black Wall Street. Instead of putting our time and our energy into hate, into thinking someone's better than another one, what if we put all that time and energy and those resources into uplift, into creating good for our country and the world, because it would benefit the world? What if we did the work together as a single nation? As a single nation. even knowing our differences in cultural heritage, in dance and art and song. Because having those things and knowing those things about our ancestry, about our cultures, does not get in the way of working together. That is a myth. It is a myth, and we need to stop believing it right now because we have problems to solve. And I'm suggesting that these are the ways that we start solving them. So let's have a discussion. Let's have a discussion about what's going on and how white America can join the rest of America in helping to solve it by doing the work of becoming real allies, real resistors to what has gone before we go too far. Next slide. That's just for you guys to have a look at if you want to be in touch with me or get into, I did not leave my email there. Oh my gosh. So if you have a pen and paper or someone can put it in the chat for me, it is B as in boy, LCC.coop@gmail.com. Get in touch with me. I would be happy to entertain any questions you have. If I don't have the question, because despite what some people say, I am not a know-it-all. But I will point you in the right direction so that you can get an answer to your question. Next slide. And justice for all. That's at the end of our Pledge of Allegiance, which many of us have stopped saying because it's not true. I hope one day it is. Racial justice, food justice, health care, land access. None of the above are just pretty words or interesting concepts. They are not luxury items. They are breath, life. They are human rights, justice. They are decent homes, nutritious food, affordable meds, a healthy planet. And yes, we have the power working together to create that reality. Thank you. And we're gonna split off. I see there are some things in the chat. I'm gonna take a look at them. We're gonna split off into, how many people do we have? 29. How many facilitators do we have?
Yeah, so we have you, myself, and Tyler for facilitation. So do you want to do three?
Three rooms.
Does that sound good?
3 rooms. And as I speak, do you have the question I sent you?
Yes, I can post it in the chat if that would be helpful.
Please do.
Okay.
Please do. And you will have about 24 minutes to discuss that question. And then the following 15-minute session is to take, you're going to stay in that same group. You're going to take everything that you came up with in the 25 minutes, and you're going to distill it down to 2, no more than 3 of the top notions or suggestions that will enable white America to find ways to help us solve this problem. That is, fight against the very thing that if we don't get over it, will end us all. Okay, let's break.
Thanks, Patrice.
You.
And thanks, Name, our breakout maven. Thanks, Name, for being so flexible. Welcome back to my breakout group, and we'll wait for other folks to trickle in from their breakout groups.
We had trouble getting back to hour 2 or 3. It was just a lot to talk about. Anybody else here feel that way? There's just a lot to talk about.
I'm glad you said 2 to 3, because I thought it was 2, and we came up with 3, and we're like, it's 3 now.
That's great.
Yeah.
So I see something just put in the chat.
Teresa, that was me. I was just apologizing to my group that I was facilitating. We were only starting to get around our second circle.
I know we started our second circle late too. This is a huge discussion. And we are not going to get very far in 25 minutes or 15 minutes. So, but I hope everyone was able to come up with something as a place to start. So let me hear it from the facilitators. So Tyler, what did you guys come up with?
Oh, wow. I think we came up with a lot more questions than we did.
That is not a bad thing.
Did answers. Yeah. I think in that vein, I will give a little more of an overview than our specific list. We had some really valuable discussion around really what it means to even approach these conversations. I think there was a lot of reflection on how you engage with the heart and deep, authentic ways of listening. We had discussion around like what it means to honor differences and live into differences.
Honor differences and what?
And live into differences.
Okay.
We had perspectives from different cultures, different countries. Our group was not just from the United States.
Okay.
And that provided, I think, some different opportunity for reflection. And we talked a little bit, we had a little bit of discussion around land back and land rematriation and when and where that's appropriate, and the practices of how to do that, how to pass on land. Really, there are multiple people within our group that are doing, they're passing on their land in different ways. And so it was interesting, I think, just to even hear the different models that exist. So conflict, love, wholeheartedness, active listening, there's a lot of beauty there, and there's a lot of complexity there too. But
yes, indeed.
Yep.
Yes, indeed. I liked hearing that though. Because really, in order to do this, we're going to have to approach breadth and depth of issue, and there is so much there. We could talk for years and still keep coming up with different aspects of the conversation. My job is to get us to a point where we think we've begun. So Leah, what did your group come up with?
Thanks. Yeah. So there was also more than 3, but we did actually like narrow down to 3. We took your task to heart, and here we are. So one of the big ones that I think kind of was underneath everything too, that Alyssa brought into the group was we need to embody our learning. That learning is not just intellectual. We got to bring it into our bodies and make it really real. And if we're going to take action, like that needs to come from a place of embodied learning, not just intellectual learning. So we can work from our center and from our root. So that was one. And then the next was the need for white folks to recognize that whiteness is a culture, and we need to be able to name it. We need to be willing to criticize it, and we need to be willing to shift it. Because if we can't name it, then we can't see it, and then we don't see what we're doing wrong, and we can't change it. And then another one that was brought into the space was that there's so many spaces, including in the ag space, that have just this screaming whiteness. So many white people, toting progressive values in one way, and then has the all white male board or staff or and all these things. And we need to recognize when that's happening, that it is an issue, that it is a problem, and that it needs to change. So those are some of the ones. I could go on. I'm so grateful for the group, and we felt like it was a good conversation to help us embody this learning. So thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We had some interesting ones as well, and I want to there were some realizations that they had previously that were shared with us here, but the main ones that I'm going to share are I'm going to just read what people wrote. I think in looking for direction on how to steward the land, we should look to traditional practices from Indigenous people in the area. I think we have to create paying positions for these leaders to aid the community. There was one, that's funny. Old white woman, self, at an HBCU discussing with young African Americans, got feedback about Black experience, how it affects African Americans. They suggested listening to them, relating to them, and trying to understand their viewpoint. And then an acknowledgement that she could listen and imagine and try and understand, but not experience herself. As I work with my peers, they discuss their constraints, stresses, and various barriers. I'm going to say something to that in a moment. But there was another one that was really, let me see, where did it go? There it is. Organizational relationship building and acknowledging / confronting unjust situations. And the reason I mentioned those three is because they kind of cover a gamut. From what we can do starting right now to things that we have to head to. So for instance, one of our participants mentioned just accepting people as human, dealing with the humanity of us all. And I did a little bit of pushback, not because that isn't a great place to get to, but because we've had 500 years in America of doing the exact opposite. So you want to get to that place, still acknowledging culture, race, art, and things that are peculiar and particular to a culture, which does not in any way diminish anyone's humanity. So you can get there, but what are the things that we need to do along the way? And one of them would be, for instance, pushing back against immediate unjust situations that you come across. And then, where did I see? There. So it's incredibly difficult for white people to empathize with people of color. Not just because you don't have that lived experience, but because of the way our country has been designed. It is to benefit and support whiteness. That's what privilege is all about, right? So whites rarely have to see a paradigm that isn't all about them. Whereas people of color have to be, if you will, bilingual or multilingual. We know our own, but if we want success in a white designed culture, then we have to be able to speak both languages. Ours is, and frankly, just to survive, if we want to not get killed, if we want to not get jailed or imprisoned or beaten, we must understand how a white designed culture works, thinks, behaves, because those are the things that keep us breathing sometimes. But they are also the things on the other end of that that will lead us to a white designed success. And the last thing I'm going to say, because we have to close this out, I've loved doing this. It's time to close it out. And here's the thing. And in this case, I'm only going to be speaking to white America, white participants. And I'm going to curse, so I apologize ahead of time. There is a shit ton of work that has to be done. And there is a shit ton of knowledge to wrap your minds around before that work can be accomplished. And that is hard work because it is not a part of white culture to have to dig deep and even question yourself, much less question hundreds of years of what has gone on. But if you don't know and understand and acknowledge the stuff that came before, then you don't understand how these things can be happening or be true today. If you don't understand that today's police force began as slave patrols, and so by their very nature, they are meant to oppress, control, and abuse people with Black skin. And if you follow that down the line, then other people of color as well, then you will never understand why people are saying defund the police. You will never understand that. You will keep saying things like, well, he must have done something. And as an example, to this day, no one actually knows if there was a counterfeit bill that George Floyd handed over. It just got dropped. And here's the thing, even if it was, that doesn't mean he was passing deliberately a counterfeit bill. I've gotten a counterfeit bill from a bank before. I've also been paid with it. So you don't know, and if you don't know what it looks like, you don't know that you have that. And even if you put all of that to the side, It doesn't explain the murder of George Floyd. So all that crap about someone must have done something, when a cop shoots you in the back, it doesn't really matter what you did, does it? The officer was wrong. So there's all those kinds of things going on. I don't expect white Americans to come back with empathy, because that's impossible. You can't live in my shoes. But you can educate yourself. And you can bring that education to the table, and you can start acting on that education by resisting the pull of privilege and doing the work in organizations that include and open up for voices that have been silenced for far too long, because that's how we're going to work together and save our farms, create more access, and get what has been missing for 500 years, justice. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your being here.
Thank you so much, Patrice.
Last. And again, you have my information. The PowerPoint can be shared with people if they want to have that. Unfortunately, you will just have the slides, because all the words that I said that weren't in the slides are in my little notebook, and I'm not giving it up. So, but you have my phone number, you have my office mailing address, and you have my email. Please do get in touch with me. I'd love to enter into more discussions, and Black Label does have workshops, seminars, and writing workshops, so that we can really get in and dig deep. So if you want to know about any of that, then drop me your deets. Okie doke. All right. Some of you I will see tomorrow. Okay. So my name is Patrice Lockert Anthony. I'm the owner of Black Label Consulting and Coaching. I also do a writing workshop series called Writing for Change. And my work is that of racial equity and racial justice. Racial equity, to define the two, let me put it in a way that most everybody can understand. You are in your house and your roof springs leaks. Racial equity is when you use a lot of pots and pans and buckets and pails to catch that water. So you're catching the water and you're tending to the leaks. But racial justice is when you fix the roof. You don't have any more leaks. You're not doing a piecemeal thing. You're not doing a charitable thing. You're just fixing the roof so that everyone under the roof is honored and protected and can move forward with what they need to do. Next, the name of this is cultural appropriation. Sorry, I didn't mean next slide. Cultural appropriation, agriculture's racial and political realities, the truth or consequences of saving our land, lives, and planet. The entire purpose of this presentation is to make it clear that this burden, that is really a white burden, but it's been placed on the shoulders of every person of color living in this land, is to get over ourselves, work together, and solve these problems that, if we don't come together and attempt to solve, will kill us all. Next slide. naming the problem. Notions of white supremacy and a failure to do the work of discrediting and dismantling it by white Americans stops us all from solving ever-growing and fast-evolving food, land, and climate crises. What I have done is I have named that as an imprimatur, which is a person's acceptance or guarantee that something is of a good standard. That is what white privilege is. It is what white supremacy is. And it is what happens when the most populous race, if you will, we know that there aren't really races, but here we are, the political term race, when the most populous of those races, white, design a system to benefit themselves and to oppress others, but don't dial it back ever in order to address the problems that come from that system of organization, of laws, of policies, of programs, of thinking. Privilege is just about thinking, because we've never had to think, and when I say we, I don't really mean we, when white Americans don't have to pay attention to how the system benefits them and marginalizes other. So for instance, people of color in this country tend to be, if you will, multilingual. When a white person wants to succeed, they need only live as white. And I don't mean to make that quite that simplistic. We know that there are such things as problems in the reality of white American lives. That said, if you take a white person with those issues and problems, and you take a person of color with those issues and problems, particularly if they are indigenous or Black or Latino, for instance, it is not as simple a process to overcome those problems. In fact, it's more like 5 to 10 times as difficult because there are roadblocks that have been placed in the way on purpose to keep the status quo as it is. So white supremacy is such an imprimatur that in America, American systems, policies, laws, or programs, you're not questioning the origins of the lens, the perspective, or the reasoning behind it, because ultimately, white supremacy, white racism, white privilege has no logic attached to it at all. There is no rock solid foundation under it. It is simply a myth created to uphold a people who rarely, through systems, earned what they had. And even when other who had been oppressed succeeded, often the result, documented historical results, were that a group of whites would be upset, come along and burn it down. These are the things that we have to get past if we're going to succeed at turning our natural world around, given how much damage we have caused. Next. Slide, next slide. What you don't know can hurt you, what you dismiss can hurt you, what you ignore can hurt you, and what you don't want to bother with, ... Racism, bigotry, privilege, and prejudice are impractical BS charlatanism, which absolutely negatively impacts solving the problems of climate change, soil loss, food production, and our planet's destruction. Next. This is a quote from President Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 60s. It is not just Negroes, but all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry. In other words, while white systems designed to perpetrate supremacy over others oppresses those others, it in very real ways, which we are seeing play out, also is destructive and damaging and horrific for white Americans. Next slide. Practical realities versus systemic marginalizing. Next slide. The slides will be given to everybody. I want you guys to pay particular attention to this one, and there are so much more. I will try to send out links to resources for you guys after this. African-American agricultural innovators, Henry Blair, two models of seed planters, George Washington Carver, 300 plus products derived from peanuts. In addition to innovative agricultural methods, he developed an ag extension program that taught people about restoring nitrogen to depleted soil. Ring a bell, anybody? Norbert Rillieux patent for the multiple effect vacuum evaporator used to change entirely the sugar processing industry. It is also used for condensed milk, gelatin, soap, glue, and whiskey. Frederick McKinley Jones was a mechanical genius at a time when it was incredibly difficult for Blacks to get patents. And by the way, I just want to add that during the height of bringing African slaves to America, those human beings who used their brilliance didn't get money or credit or patents for what they created, for what they innovated and invented. Those patents, that credit and that money went to their white masters. So there's a lot that we owe to Indigenous peoples, to Asian peoples, to Latino peoples, to African peoples for what has made this country what it is. And those peoples are the ones who largely were the standard bearers for caring for land. And now, after the ruination of it and the climate, we're going back and we're saying regeneration or regenerative land uses, but we're only talking about white people's ideas, and we're not honoring the fact that these ideas came from the people that they oppressed. That's a problem, and it leaves out a lot of the knowledge, the wisdom that we need to access to do better. Next slide. Next slide. Black soil. So here is, we're going to go into these, we talked yesterday, we're going to talk some more today, a deeper dive, and we're going to start changing how we think. Because the ways that we have thought before, which has led to our laws and our policies and our programs, hiring practices, that all needs to shift because it's based on reasoning that isn't so reasonable. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. So we need a new perspective on change for healing the land and the planet. So we're gonna try for a rebirth of reason. We're gonna try to be a real community, a whole, holistic community. We're gonna talk about what it means to work together. I'm gonna talk about ways in which white America citizens can participate in inclusive work that saves us all. The example I want to give is one I gave yesterday. Think of it, let's talk about hair. Black woman in California doesn't get a job, discovers that the reason she didn't get it is because they considered her hair to be unprofessional. She sued, she won. The other side, the company, took it back to the table, and a higher court ruled in their favor and said, well, of course it's unprofessional. So the decision was reversed. What came about from that is that both California and New York State passed laws that you can't discriminate against a person's hair. Now, I want people to recognize just how ludicrous it is to have a law for something like that. So wearing my hair the way it grows in my head is a problem, but wearing your hair the way it grows into a white person's head is no problem. Here's the real problem with it. One, doesn't affect how I do my work. Two, it costs me more to wear my hair the way white hair grows into the head than it does to wear it the way it automatically grows in my head. Also, the process that is used to do that is toxic, very toxic, very expensive, all so that I can fit in with what someone else considers to be the standard of beauty and professionalism that makes zero sense in terms of doing the work that's needed. So we're going to go into these breakout rooms, and we're going to talk about the subjects that we came up with, suggestions we came up with last time. One room is going to talk about engaging with heart so that you can do deep, authentic listening. And they're going to talk about the when and how of land rematriation. Another group is going to talk about embodying learning so that it's not just intellectual, and the need for whites to recognize whiteness as a culture as opposed to a supreme race. And then the third group is going to break out and discuss learning the truth and acknowledging the truth so that you can confront the lies and the misdirects. And second, power transitions from white-led to people of color-led organizations, meetings, boards, so forth and so on. With that said, let's split up into groups.
Hearing that their stories have been appropriated, and like advocating for them and like calling that stuff out, because so often it gets ignored, or we don't take action when those things are happening. And so much of what our group shared was like showing up. You know, you've got to show up for the work. You've got to show up for those conversations and be an advocate for other people learning. Yeah, I'm getting rambly at this point, but that's the other part was that Nancy shared a list of resources that deal with how to make land access and land rematriation more financially feasible for all the parties involved. And that's a form of education too. What are the resources out there? How do we make sure people are aware of how that can happen? Because people want to be a part of that, but we have to figure out also how to make it work. And we didn't have as many answers for that, but there are people working on it. And if we can connect to those people and educate ourselves, then I think we're getting there. Group, I hope I did okay. Oh, you guys were awesome.
That was great. What about Leah's group? Embodying our learning rather than just being intellectual about it, and a need for whites to recognize whiteness as a culture.
Yeah, I am happy to share back, but just want to, is there someone who else was in our group who's excited to share back? Make space for that in case there is someone. Okay, I'll just go for it. So I think one of the things that we ended up talking about at the end is the importance of being really good and active listeners, and how I think both of these points are really critical to that, with the need for white people to recognize whiteness as culture. One of the things we talked about is just how culture includes things that are flashy and obvious, like holidays and food and things like that, but it's also includes a lot of more invisible things that we're just steeped in, and without being aware of what that is, and what white culture values, it has real impacts on how we treat people who may be different, in terms of like thinking of things as right or wrong, or good and bad, and that it's so important to be aware of these things that we're steeped in that may contribute to judgments of other cultures, in embodying or learning, and not just thinking about these issues and addressing these issues in an intellectual way. We end up talking about how in order to be a good listener, like you have to be aware of how you're feeling, and that's a really important sort of signal to pay attention to. Like if you're having a conversation and something feels challenging, or sort of like puts you, feeling uncomfortable, that's an important thing to listen to, and to try to understand, like, where is that coming from, and why am I feeling this way? And that there is often a tendency in white culture to try to solve issues from this very intellectual, like, I'm going to use my brain and these resources to like try to come up with this solution, and to not stop to think at all about the emotional aspect of it, and particularly when we're talking about listening to others, or really trying to help others, that before just charging in with an intellectual, like, this is how things should be fixed or need to be done, that it's really important to also value feelings in the same way that I think white culture values intellect.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Does anyone else in the group have anything to add? I'll take that as a no. The last piece before we close out were the people who were in my group, and we were looking at learn the truth, acknowledge the truth, and then confronting the lies and misdirects, and power transitions from white-led to person of color-led. And we didn't really get into that last one in as much as the first one overlay it. So is there anyone from the group that wants to share anything, or do you want me to just share what we talked about? And I'm gonna take that as a so we talked a lot, and we had a lot of experiences and examples given. I was so happy with the way this group worked. There have been book groups and discussion groups. There have been there's been some deep thinking about how other groups, not just whites, have engaged in anti-Blackness, and understanding the story behind that. There was my mention of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, and how towards the end of that book, he says that Black folks may have to be white people's mirror in doing this work, because there isn't any other group in America that has lived as closely and been as intrinsically linked as Blacks and whites because of slavery and because of the things that we were, Black folks were forced to do in slavery, everything from sexual relations to having our children sold from birth, and then having to use our mother's milk to feed the master's babies. So we're linked at the spiritual level. And so maybe that work needs to, and so the idea from James Baldwin is that we might be the ones best suited, I think suited is the wrong word, but by experience to help whites come to grips with the history. There was also Emily, I think it was Emily, who was talking about starting at home. Having a farm, for instance, and bringing youth of color into experience what that is, what that means, and then having conversations about that experience and how it can impact who you are, your culture, that sort of thing. Emily. And then there was, where did it go?
I think that was Wendy.
Was it Wendy? I'm sorry, Wendy. And then you're right. Emily was about being honest instead of abdicating responsibility. Oh, it's whoever is speaking, it's breaking up. Can you type it in the chat? And then we had Isabella talking about education through reading and podcasts, and this notion that she and others got from reading Ibram Kendi's book, but he borrowed it from Angela Davis, that you need to be anti-racist, the act of being anti-racist, the verb use, not the noun. You have to do the work. And there was so much more. We talked about what it means to be white. We talked about white fragility, vulnerability, and that it's okay to have the fragility as long as you know you have it, you acknowledge that you have it, and then in the listening and the learning, that fragility is transformed into a strength for going forward. Is there anything else, guys, that I miss? Okay, yeah, Emily said that, okay. And anything else? Otherwise, I'm gonna start wrapping it up. Is there anyone else in the 24? Thank you, Emily. Is there anyone else in the 24 that would like to add something that maybe you've thought of in the sharing that we could do to help take us further on our path to healing?
I'd like to add.
I like that. I'm sorry, there's Shannon Mays wrote that Julie Sullivan from Quivira always says you can't claim something as a value unless you act on it. I love that. And Deanna, what were you saying? I'm sorry.
I apologize. I would like to just offer for consideration a training that's available for free online. It's called Heart Math.
Heart Math?
Heart Math, HEARTMATH. It is a technique that is available, and I always try to ask folks to breathe through their heart when they're in a group or by themselves. And so I'll just throw that out there, and thank you. This has been an amazing, personal, cathartic experience for me. Thank you very much.
That is, thank you. I treasure that. Thank you so much. As we close this out, I'm going to ask everyone, first of all, to close their eyes and take a very deep breath in through their nose and then breathe it back out through their mouth. And just center yourselves. This is hard work. It's invigorating work. It can be exciting work, but it is also difficult and challenging work for all of us. Now, open your eyes and be with me as I say all of what I just said is true. But it is still work that must be done. Whatever the challenge, whatever the roadblocks, whatever the isms, it is still work that must be done. We have, in fact, reached a point on Earth where what we have done is so catastrophic that if we don't come together to work the problem, there's no place else to go, and it's not too late. Almost, but it's not. We are not there yet, and we need to work together. And all this other stuff goes away only two ways. One, we work on it ourselves and we heal, or we do nothing, we don't work together, and we don't find a solution to climate change, to soil erosion. We impact our food, we impact our water, we impact our breath, we impact our lives. That's not really a difficult formula to understand. So now let's do the work. Hold hands, breathe together, and do it. You have the tools. There are magazines and books and movies and documentaries and television and billboards, and there's all kinds of ways to get the information that we need. And then don't forget, humans and lower forms of animals, because it makes me mad when people say humans and animals, because we're animals too. And quite frankly, I think there's a lot to learn from other animals. But it's time for us to do the work. That doesn't mean the rage is automatically gone, because I can tell you there are times when I have some powerful rage going on about how I get treated, about how others get treated. But you can't focus on the rage, and you can't keep that rage going and still solve the problems that we have to do. So go knowing that I have shared myself with you, you guys have shared yourselves with me, and we've done some good work here. And now you take it home and you act on it. And if you need to, I have put my information in the chat. So save that chat so that you can have access to it. You can do that by going to the bottom, and there's 3 dots to the right. When you click on those, it says save chat, and you can just click on that. I am so blessed to have had you in this workshop, in this presentation. Thank you all for coming, and I wish you peace and wellness and blessings abundantly. Go forth and share. And I'm ending it like 5 minutes early because you need time to mull and think.
Thank you, Patrice.
Thank you,
For your-
Mia.
Yeah, for your time and energy and wisdom. And let's listen to Patrice and let's do the work. Thanks, everyone.